Hello, and welcome to another episode of Theater XYZ, a podcast where people from different backgrounds will be talking about issues facing the theater industry today. We're your hosts, Bailey Sheehan,
Dom Ocampo,
and Matt Faragasso.
We'd like to welcome you to our show, and before we get started, we'd like to take this opportunity to respectfully acknowledge that we are hosting this land from the traditional lands of the Lenni people who have stewarded this land for generations.
Today, the Z joining us is Dom Ocampo, a current student here at Lehigh University. And the topic we'll be discussing today is whether or not theaters have an obligation to address social justice issues.
We'd like to acknowledge that we're all here to learn and discuss, and that as people we can grow and our opinions can change. Nicole Brewer, an anti-racist theater educator, put it perfectly when she said the following: "We must recognize that we are both learning and unlearning, and while we are doing that, we are going to create harm. So, giving ourselves the grace that allows ourselves to speak in draft, and knowing that that does not define who we are, that it is not the final version of ourselves. This is really important towards forgiveness and building our shame resilience and being able to show up and do this work."
So we've been doing this podcast for a little bit, and at the end of last semester, we received some really great feedback that people wish they knew the backgrounds of the people talking about these different issues, just to see where we're coming from. So I'll start. This is Bailey here, Bailey's voice. I am a 28-year-old, not quite straight, cisgender white woman, and I use she, her pronouns.
I am Matt. This is Matt's voice. I am a 34-year-old straight cisgender white male, and I use he, him, his.
So I'm Dom. Hi, I'm a 20-year-old pansexual or otherwise queer Filipino-American woman, and I use either she, her, or they, them pronouns.
All right, everyone, and we're back, and we are going to be talking about children's theater, which people were very excited about. So Matt, would you like to give us a little info about children's theater and the obligation to address social justice issue in children's theater?
I would love to. This is an area where almost across the board, everyone agreed that children's theater was a great place to start talking about social justice issues. I think we only had 3 people who said no. I think something you have to understand about kids is that I think, at least for me, I don't have any kids, but I work with them a lot, and I feel like they're super smart, and sometimes smarter than I even want to give them credit for. They're just little sponges. I mean, they soak up everything you say, and they understand metaphors and totally get theater. You know what I mean? I think they can be very engrossed by it. So I think it's a great place to start talking about these topics. And some of the things that people said about it was like it's too heavy for children and it's not the time or place. And I disagree. I think it doesn't have to be heavy to make a point, right? Even if you just have diversity in a children's show or a show about sustainability. I mean, right? They don't have to be these super hard-hitting topics to make sense, especially for kids, but let them start drawing connections between what they see on stage in real life.
Yeah, because kids aren't born prejudiced, right? Like, they don't have that in them. It's all learned behavior.
100%. So something we did find about the Children's Theater Company, mission statement, it's called ACT. Children's Theater Company, cohesive platform for access, justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion in our audience, program, staff, and board. 3 interdependent words of action give our a commitment to a future when our theater is a home for all people and all families, reflective of our community. The 3 words: access, content, and transform. And one of the cool things I liked about this article, and then I'm bringing it up, is that they gave metrics for success. So they're holding themselves to a standard. They're very transparent. This is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to hold ourselves accountable.
And real quick, this is Children's Theater Company in Minnesota, and this is a new mission statement after Black Lives Matter, right? They had a different one and they transformed it.
Correct.
After the We See You What document came out.
Yeah,
okay.
They changed everything to mirror some of these calls for justice. What did we say? Access. So the audience, they hope one of their measures of success is the access, right? That their audience will mirror the demographic of the state of Minnesota. To connect to their local businesses and hope and get support from local community organizations, and then transform how they're going to transform their operations. One is operational improvement. 2 is patron experience, which is that new patrons not only feel welcome into their space, but also feel affirmed in the space. They want to gain valuable feedback from their patrons through observation and patron surveys. And then their attendance impact is when we open the door wider, it is important that everyone who wants to come in can. I thought it was great, again, that they broke it down and that they made metrics for success and they're going to hold themselves accountable to the future they want to see.
I think what's really cool about all that is, again, they don't talk at all about content of their shows. They're talking about who is on stage, who is watching from the audience, and who is creating it. I think that's so important that this theme keeps coming up again, that the content of your shows matter less than seeing representation on stage, by seeing representation of people backstage, by elevating disenfranchised voices. None of that says like, these are the types of shows we're going to do. It's, we want to get more audience members into our space and make sure that they feel welcomed, and this is how we're going to do it. I just want to emphasize that even in this completely revamped mission statement, which everyone can agree, except I don't really know anything about the demographics of the state of Minnesota. So you know, maybe it could be a little bit more diverse from what I imagine Minnesota to be, but that's fine. Yeah, again, doesn't say anything about content of shows. I feel like a lot of the people who took our survey were like, no, we can't do shows that are all about social justice. But I mean, really nothing we found says that every show has to have that as like the main message.
I also love how they had metrics for achieving success. So like a lot of times with any business, including theater companies, when it comes to like social justice missions, it's like, what is our goal? Like, what are we aiming for? How do we know that we're doing a good job? And I love that they're super transparent about like, this is exactly what we want our company to look like. This is how we know that we're doing the right thing. And in everything that we do, we're going to be striving for these metrics so that everybody's on the same page. I think transparency is something that's, I don't know if it's difficult to achieve, but it's definitely not like a trend for any business to be super transparent about their goals and how they're going to achieve them. Just like this outline itself and the fact that it exists is like, I think, a great example of how people can move forward to make sure in general that they're on the right track.
I don't think it's difficult to achieve transparency. I think it's uncomfortable to achieve transparency because by setting transparent goals and saying, here's our goal and we didn't meet that, I feel like feels bad. You know, same with like salary transparency. That's part of the We See You What document. Like if you make everyone in the theater post their salary, people are going to be upset. Absolutely. You know, if I find out that the person at the top of my food chain is making like 40 times the amount I am, that's not great. So yeah, I think transparency. And again, I mean, it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's important to be uncomfortable when you're trying to do better. And by holding yourself to these goals and holding yourself accountable, and public accountability is so powerful. You know, if you're like, here are all these goals, we haven't hit any of them, then the public's like, okay, maybe try something else. But you know, like I think it's important that at least they can see you're trying. Maybe your goals were a little too lofty, but I feel like transparency is so important. One of the quotes that we pulled from our survey takers on whether or not children's theater has an obligation to address social justice issues is absolutely. We receive so much subliminal racist, misogynist, ableist, etc. messaging throughout our lives. So I think it's important for children to be exposed to an antidote. I believe all these principles can be engaged in an age-appropriate way because when it comes down to it, it's all about being good people to one another. So, and as Matt shared before, out of the 60 survey takers, 57 of them agreed that social justice issues need to start with children's theater in age-appropriate ways. And that's what a lot of the like comments were, that, you know, a lot of children's theater already has some messaging of like, don't be a bully and be kind to one another and don't talk back to your parents or whatever it is. So as long as we just shift that messaging, most kids' stories have some sort of, you know, allegory or something like that. So I think it's important to just replace that with maybe more important issues. Not that bullying's not important, of course it is, but do you have to do 3 shows about bullying? Can you do one about racism? And you know, something that I think is interesting for us to talk about, we've had this conversation a lot as the 3 of us, just, you know, when we were kind of planning out this episode of what children's theater can be. You know, is it important to have very hard-hitting stories that like really get through to children? But some parents might not bring their kids to see that. So is it important to cast a wider net and get more kids involved, but has maybe like less of an impactful message? I don't know. Thoughts?
I think that's such a good question, and honestly, it can go either way, right? Because there are pros and cons to both ways. I think maybe we could strike a balance in between where it's like, okay, we'll do like one like narrower focused show, and then we'll do one with a wider threshold so that everybody gets what they want. Also, just like the question itself of whether we should value the quantity of like children that are coming and absorbing this information versus like the quality or the the specific lessons that we want to get across. I don't have an answer to that, but like, which is like the hard part, right? Because it's, yes, even like one child learning something about like anti-racism, even like among their friends or like in any context is like huge. To have that as a lesson that you learn when you're very young, can like set it up for you to really understand it later on. Impacting the mind of even one child is amazing, but also like the more kids that we reach, the more people are going to like hear about it and be
Mhm.
sort of spreading that word in their everyday lives. So I don't know. Like, I if I were the head of a theater company and I had to pick like out of like one or the other, like I wouldn't know what to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not an easy question to answer. It falls in one of those gray areas again. I think if I had to pick, I would pick a gentler message to reach more people. My biggest fear would be if like you get the reputation for doing all these like really hard hitting, really challenging children's shows, you might alienate some of that audience by parents who don't want to send their kids to those shows. Are the kids going to come home with too many questions that mom and dad don't want to answer or don't want to talk about? Then do you end up with an echo chamber? The only people who are going to come see your show are the kids whose mom and dad talk about it at home anyway. So are you going to be able to influence other people? So in my mind, if the message might be a little less direct or a little more folded into the story, or it's a gentler nudge in a direction, even if a parent is upset, it might not turn them off entirely. Is the kid subconsciously going to know these things and just act in a different manner as opposed to going home and asking all these questions? Do you keep a return customer base by not being too overt? So again, I don't know that there's a good answer. I think my answer would be a wider net, cast your net wider. I think it all just depends on your base, right? On your audience, what's your demographic, where you are. So there.
I would agree with that, especially what you were saying about parents that bring their kids to the really hard-hitting ones are more likely to talk about that at home already, because I just think, maybe some of these kids, their parents bringing them to see these plays might be the only exposure they get to, like, how to be kind to other people. It's just a reality. A lot of people come from, like, very troubled backgrounds and have really bad childhoods, or, maybe their parents are dealing with a lot of, like, repressed emotions. And I mean, there are kids with racist parents. That's just a fact. So if the parents, think it's just a show about like two puppies or whatever, and somehow this theater like makes you think about race in some way and how to like not be prejudiced, that might be the only exposure this kid gets. And that's really important. One of the things that we talked about a little bit, Theater of the Oppressed, which is like a theater movement, they have a type of theater called forum theater or bystander training. And essentially what it is, it's like a scripted situation. And then they ask members of the audience to like insert themselves into different people in the room's like roles to see how they would react. And kids love playing pretend. I think that would be a really, like Theater of the Oppressed for kids would be really cool. So that way you can like put a kid in a situation and be like, how would you react? Or how would you feel if you saw this person reacting to a way? If you're getting bullied and these people are ignoring you, like that doesn't feel good. And if you are the person watching someone getting bullied, how do you react? I think getting kids really involved and really hands-on is the way to like make an impact by putting themselves in it, and that way they can kind of get the impact a little bit more.
I totally agree. I think also, and part of it comes from the fact that I'm just like a huge fan of Theater of the Oppressed as a concept. I mean, I've talked about this before, but like you don't get a lot of opportunities as a family to like go out. Like if you're bringing your kid to these shows, you don't get the opportunity to like participate in theater together and learn these lessons in a way that is so creative. I think it doesn't just have to be about the child. Like this can be an opportunity for parents to navigate social justice issues and just issues in general together with their kid, and bring home really important themes. Because it's one thing to sit down with your child and like have like a conversation, which can like be really nerve wracking at home. But to like go in and like do it in like a way that's fun and interactive. Like I know when I was a kid, I had like zero attention span, so
Yeah.
that has to be great for them. It's awesome to like show them by doing it. And it also like goes to show that social justice education does not have to be daunting all the time. And I'm a firm believer that it shouldn't be. Making it accessible to every age level and digestible without like triggering a person is essential to getting the word out to everybody. So this is just like one really cool way that kids can be introduced to such complex topics in a way that's like safe and enjoyable for them.
And parents can avoid having an uncomfortable conversation with your kids because I'm like thinking about when I was going through puberty, whatever. Um, and I remember my Girl Scout troop went to the like local hospital and we had like a puberty event where they had like nurses and stuff and they like showed us videos about like tampons and the changes your body will go through and they made it like this whole like Girl Scout themed event and it was so fun and I learned so much. If my mom tried to sit me down and have that conversation, I would be like, "Oh my god, mom, like shut up. I don't want to hear this," you know? But since you're in a setting where like it's normalized and there are educated people who can talk to you in a way, they're professionals, you know? If a theater near you is doing a kid's show about race, but you're like, I don't have all the information. Like Matt said, sometimes when you're unaware or uneducated on a topic, you tend to just avoid it because you're like, I don't want to be wrong and like give my kid the wrong information. Just bring them to the local theater and they're going to learn something about it. They're always looking for ideas. And if you don't want to have a conversation with your kid, just tell your theater to do it. It'll be fine.
I would like you guys to cover topics X, Y, and Z so I don't have to.
I mean, you're the professionals. If you're gonna get through to your kid, how many times are parents like, I can't get through to my kid. My kid is like doing this, but like they listen to their friends, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know. I just think that it's an underutilized resource, and I'm glad that there are theaters that are doing it. There's a couple theaters that are doing really heavy hitting things. There's a children's theater in Texas. I want to say Dallas, and they are doing like very hard hitting but age appropriate. They have two different like age groups. I think one is like 4 to 8, and the other one is like 9 to 15 that are specifically about like police brutality and racism against Black people. And they have like surveys after and like follow up packets to like give to the parents of like, here's how to continue the conversation. Here are more resources, things like that. So there are theaters that are doing that with great success. But I do wonder again, if is it just like the heat of 2020, everyone cares about Black Lives Matter now, you know, like I hope it continues. I hope they can continue to do these programming that people don't like lose interest. But that's really cool that they're doing it. But yeah, I definitely think, I mean, children, you have to start with kids, you know. I wish that, you know, I'm actively trying to be anti-racist, but if I had just been trained to be anti-racist from when I was like 4 years old, you know, like it'd be so much better.
I 100% agree with everything you just said. I don't want to not chime in about this conversation, but I don't know what else to add. Honestly, I think you both covered it very well. You know, I think the kids will have fun being engaged in theater. You know, how cool is it to be like, did we handle that correctly? How would you handle it? How does that make you feel? And when you start talking to the kids and getting them to express how they feel or what they think about a situation, I feel like it'll stay with them so much more than if they just watch it, right? Are they spacing out? Are they paying attention? But when you engage them, I think, right, the idea and the hope is there that it sticks with them. Oh, that's right. If I were the one being bullied, I wouldn't be happy. Why would I do that to somebody else? So again, I don't have a whole lot to add, but I agree with everything that I think including and getting kids engaged is a great way to have some hard conversations or to get them to think more about some things. So yeah, good on people who do it, and hopefully more people do it. So
Yeah. And I think it's also, just to add really quickly on this thing, representation matters so much, you know, being able to see yourself in a role. You know, I'm white. I've always seen people that look like me on stage, but I know a lot of people of color. Like it really means a lot when you see, especially as a child, and you see yourself reflected on the people on stage. I feel like that could change. There's a lot of debate right now about like, oh, well, the reason we're not hiring people of color is because there's not enough of them that do theater. But I mean, this is how you start, right? If you show kids that, you know, Black women can be actors and Asian women can be actors and a woman in a wheelchair, I don't know why they're all women, and a woman in a wheelchair can be an actor, then you can too, you know, and that's how we start getting this love of theater initiated, you know, like, I don't know, Dom, you're the only person of color in this room right now. But do you think like you would have differently if you saw people that looked like you on stage?
I absolutely like my childhood would have been revolutionized if I saw another like Filipino person like on stage or like in TV shows and stuff like that. I think there's a very specific way that you learn the world is if you don't see yourself in media or just like in different environments you're exposed to in general. I went to private school, Catholic private school my whole life before Lehigh. And I was usually one of the only people of color. Like from kindergarten through like 6th grade, there were only I think I was the only person of color in my grade, but we were also like there were like 30 of us or something like that.
Mhm.
Which is still like it can be like incredibly like weird like when you bring like I don't know like I'd bring my mom's like home cooked Filipino food and then they'd be like why
Mhm.
does it smell like that, and just like the little things like when you don't see other people or you don't see your experience represented, it can be really isolating and you can start feeling ashamed of it. But I grew up like watching like kids cartoons like Powerpuff Girls and like Blue's Clues, and recently they rebooted Blue's Clues, and the new like guy who like runs it or whatever and like talks to the kids and stuff, he's Filipino, and like he brings his like grandmom onto the show and like they speak in Tagalog and like talk about like their culture and stuff like that, and it's so normal. And somebody sent a video of it to me and I literally started crying. I was like, if I had this when I was a kid it would have been so different, because it's just I feel like when people talk about like representation like in theater, there's a very specific way that they see it, whether it be like talking about the generational trauma or making their race like be like a huge part of their role in a show, but like just having them be there and like maybe mention it like once or twice can still be like a huge deal to a lot of people. It really does make a difference, I think, to like even just like see somebody that looks like you on the stage. It's like it's including more people in your story, and there's like that sort of like understanding from your audience that sees that makes them feel more connected. So like everybody wins. I think, yeah. Like to answer your question, like yes, representation is super amazing, and I should not be crying at a children's cartoon when I am 20 years old. But here we are.
So clearly we all feel this obligation. But again, as we said before, it's not really quite so cut and dry. And some people don't feel like they have this obligation. So we just kind of want to like lay all the cards on the table and offer some suggestions for, like we've said, a lot of our survey takers think that the only way to address social justice issues is to do very hard-hitting social justice plays. But here's some quotes that we had from people who didn't quite agree with us. One person said, if children's theater should address social justice issues, they said, not at all. Adding a forced agenda to children's theater would again neglect our base audience. And another person said on the obligation to address social justice issues, no, we do art, not social work with questionable morality. I don't really know how you can neglect your base audience by being more inclusive, but unless you want your base audience to be very let's just say it, white, unless you want your base audience to just be white, I I don't know how you could neglect anyway. There are people that disagree with us. That's just what I'm going to say. I don't want to attack these poor people that graciously took our survey for us.
Right.
Thanks for taking our survey. Here's why you're wrong.
If you could do better,
Yeah, if you could have said less.
Yeah.
maybe just say no. Maybe just...
Yeah. But we are very grateful to everyone who took our survey. And again, like you don't have to agree with us. A lot of times people think theater is like very progressive and liberal, and like where we are in like Pennsylvania that may be true, but there's theaters all over. Not all of them yeah. There was a high school in Texas that did an all-white version of Hairspray, so we'll just say that.
Just leave that where it is.
Yeah, I think again we just need to stop assuming that default is white. Base audience is, as Dom said, can be isolating and othering to everyone else in the world.
Yeah, and I also like want to comment on like the idea that like we do art, not social work with questionable morality. Which like there are a lot of words in that sentence I could dissect right now. But I think that this statement really comes from like a lack of diversity in theater companies, especially theater companies being like run by primarily white cis males. People who are privileged and come from like these backgrounds can see social work as quote unquote separate from art, when for like the oppressed and for marginalized communities that social work is like intrinsically connected to everything that they
Mhm.
do because they live it. So like to say like, oh, we do art not social work with questionable morality is like completely excluding like a huge part and a huge draw that people create for. Yeah, like it's
The ability to ignore it at all is a privilege. Like, it's like when people say like, "Oh, I don't get involved in politics." And it's like, "Well, politics are involved with you." If you can just ignore the whole political landscape that we're in, like that's a huge privilege. To not think that it affects you is a huge privilege. If you don't think that the laws that are being made, if you don't see the importance of doing theater that has social justice work, that's a privilege because that means that the theater already caters to you. It's so frustrating. Opinions aside, even if you do think that you have an obligation to social justice, that doesn't always mean that people execute it. And Matt, can you give us some reasons why even like well-intentioned people who are like, yes, we should do this, we believe in this, why they might not?
Sure. I think a lot of that comes down to money. Here's a quote. The financial implications are always a challenge from donors, foundations, and patrons. We are slowly breaking out of relying on the standard giving scenarios and realizing we can develop support from other areas, people with a new direction. So, right, what that says to me is they're reaching out to different people, different organizations, different companies, different people in their community who will support a more diverse landscape of theater. Because, right, if your donors are saying, we're going to withhold money if you do that, or unless you do this, you're just perpetuating a cycle of exclusivity, right? So I think whoever this was from, I'm glad to see that their theater is trying to break that cycle and break the mold of being so dependent on people who don't want to be diverse.
Yeah, Matt, I absolutely agree. Financial reckoning is really what most of the people on our survey said that they felt beholden to their board, they felt beholden to their donors. And I mean, truthfully, we're talking about marginalized and disenfranchised people. Those people don't have a lot of money to donate to the theater. So you really need people behind you that also have the same morals and ethics that you do and that they understand the importance of doing shows for people that don't look like them. You know, a lot of people were worried about ticket sales, they're worried about their base audience, and your company doesn't have to be entirely socially just. Not every show has to have this like direct message of, you know, social justice issues. One of my favorite playwrights, Liz Duffy Adams, she has like a interesting backdrop of like climate issues in her plays. Like her plays aren't about climate injustice or the huge climate crisis we have, but it's always like a background thing. So she has like a whole story, but it's mentioned like several times throughout the story that we're in like the future and like the whole world's taken over by plastic. So the whole set is made out of like plastic and these remnants. You can see the effects of our actions, and now these people are like trying to live in it. Or we just commissioned her to do a play last year that the name is escaping me.
The Broken
Dog Act,
Machine.
the Broken
The
Machine.
Broken Machine, that's right. Um, Dog Act
Thanks,
was
Tom.
before. I know. The Broken Machine, where the whole world is literally on fire because of the way people treated our planet. So the play is about people escaping the fire. It's not really about how we got to the fire. It's like subtext. It's really interesting the way that she like does that. And you could definitely do that. I would say her plays have messages of social justice, but like you don't really realize it. You're like, that was a cool story. And then you're like, oh yeah. Well, they were escaping that because we destroyed our planet. Yeah. So obviously there's different ways to address it. Alienating your audience base is an interesting, to me, it's like really interesting that people feel that will get in the way. What do you think, Dom?
I was actually just gonna say, and maybe this is just because like this is how I like to enjoy theater, but like I think that like theater should make people uncomfortable. Like we go to theater to feel things and to connect and to take like lessons and stories home. And part of that can be like we should learn something and get uncomfortable. I think a lot of the audience members that these survey takers specifically are talking about are folks who are privileged enough to not have to face these issues and are uncomfortable facing it because it doesn't happen to them and like they could have done something about it. So like a huge part of learning to be a good ally is like recognizing that like there are going to be a lot of topics and a lot of things that happen that are going to make you uncomfortable and you're going to wish that they didn't happen, but the reality is that they do. So I think that theater specifically can be used as like a way to force people to look at like what we have done and like what we can do about it. I love Liz Duffy Adams as well, and I was fortunate enough to be in Dog Act, which is her other play that Lehigh did, and I agree in that, like, it doesn't have to be in your face, this is the message that we want all the time. There are certain ways that you can implement different theater tactics to make sure that people are taking important lessons home. I think we talked a little bit earlier about like who's designing these plays, who's casting them, who's involved in the season selection. There are different ways that you can involve activism in your work, and it doesn't have to be like explicit in the script. If you're worried about doing super controversial plays and don't want to take that step, there's still ways to like make your audience aware without like spelling it out for them. And I think that it's just respectful to your audience to assume that like you don't have to spell it out for them sometimes. Theater can be challenging, and I think it's fun when it is.
I think it's also doing your audience a huge injustice to assume they don't want to see these shows. You know, if you are making the assumption for your entire audience that they don't want to see certain people on stage or talk about the stories of certain people, like that might not be true. And you know, I think it's also important to talk about who we do want in our theater. If you think your audience is racist and homophobic and transphobic and ableist, maybe those aren't the people that you want coming to see your shows. I mean, that's not a theater. If they cater towards that audience, that is not a theater I would ever work for in 1,000 years. Theater makers do look at companies' mission statements and past shows when they go to apply there. And that would be a huge red flag for me to see the types of shows that they're doing. If they're like very narrow focused, you know, I specifically look for jobs that have hard hitting shows. But I think it's important to talk about who we want. You know, if this doesn't cater to your audience, maybe you're going to get a new audience. You know, if you've been alienating part of your community to cater to one part of your community, maybe switch them. Maybe start catering to the other part of your company. And if that alienates the other audience, but you bring in a whole new fresh audience, maybe that's worth it in the long run. I mean, if not for your morals, like financially, maybe. There's an interesting technique called like the foot in the door technique. A lot of politicians use it, and basically it's like moving the goalpost. So you make this like huge request of your audience or your board or your donors, and you're like, we're gonna do all plays like this, and they're like, no. Then you're like, all right, well, what if we compromise and do this? Then you've just set yourself forward a little bit more to where they're compromised. So then you can say, okay, we're at this level now. Make another big request. They shoot you down, and then you compromise more, but you're just gaining footing each time. You're gaining more towards your side by pulling them over. Gross political technique, but it could work in our favor this time.
I think that you bring up like a great point about theater and like social justice theater specifically from a financial perspective with your donors and with your audience. Like, do we want to be financing our theaters on the money of people we don't agree with, or the money of those like who oppress and want to like stay within like that box? And I think it's hard because it's multifaceted. Like, you can't educate without a platform, and if nobody's giving you money, then you don't have that platform. But also, like, if the majority of your audience disagrees with the mission that you want to pursue, then what was the mission statement of your theater company? Like, is there something foundational that drew these people to your work? Like, you know, have you been doing work that's founded on oppression or supremacist ideals? And I like could go on like a whole tangent about like whether it's even possible to dismantle that if like your line of work is like built on creating like that bubble and sort of like protecting those people's views. But also, regardless of that, like if you're worried about losing the money of these people but wanting to draw in more folks, like, are you thinking with goals and projects that you want to pursue, are you thinking short term or long term? Like, are you only thinking in big steps, like with that foot in the door sort of perspective that can scare those people, or are you also thinking about how you can support like BIPOC behind the scenes and working on it in a way that we mentioned earlier, like internally?
Yeah, like meeting people where they are is something to think about too. You know, I worked for a company that I found out was catering to these things. Like, do I stay and fight? Do I try to like change the theater culture? Do I make a fuss? Or by working there, like, am I supporting it by being an employee of this company? That's hard, you know, and it's a privilege to be able to quit your job because you don't agree with their mission. You know, like, do you jump ship? Are you vocal and hope that other people who work there, like, are you afraid of getting blacklisted? It's hard. can we blame the people that are in survival mode for working at that theater? I think it's important to like look at, if there's a problematic theater, I think definitely looking at leadership is really important, but like I don't think we should be necessarily like putting any blame on like people who work for that leadership, because like it could be just a job that they need to survive. So that's something I think about a lot. I've worked for some companies before that I wasn't quite on board with how they run things, and I mean there's kind of a compromise sometimes of like, hey, I'm going to try and stay and fight and I'm going to change this and make sure it's better for the people who come after me. But like at some point you're like, this is just, I can't, like I can't, I have to get out of here. I have to find somewhere that like I feel supported. There is only so much fighting you can do, especially if you're not on leadership, if you're not in a position of power.
Well, especially too, if you have the ability to do that, can you pick up your family and move halfway across the country? Are those resources that you have? So this just kind of goes back to, can you really blame everybody who works there, right? If
Mm-hmm.
if dad's working somewhere else and making not a whole lot of money, and you're working at a theater making not a whole lot of money, can you just abandon ship and find a better one? That might not be possible. So at what point can you, and then these are where all those gray lines are, and not that we're going to find all the answers today or anything, but it's just everybody's situation is different, and hopefully you'd be able to move on and work for a better company. But like you said, is that something that you can do? Can dad find a different job somewhere else? If you find a better theater, can you support the family until dad does find a job? Can you put everybody in a car and drive for 300 miles? Who knows? So,
Mm-hmm.
right, maybe it's not always the person who they work up at that they work for. Maybe it's not the person who is working at the company, but the company. Just something to keep in mind, right? We don't all have resources to abandon ship sometimes.
Yeah. And I mean, theaters are a business. A lot of people forget that. They have to make money, they have to pay bills, they have to pay people. So I think on both sides of the coin, it's important to think of theater as a business. Sometimes people get really like sentimentally attached to a theater, but it is just a company. Like if that company goes under because of cancel culture or whatever, because they were catering to a racist audience, like so be it. It's a company made up of people, and those people can, rise from the ashes or whatever. But also, we have to think about theater from a business perspective in the way that it has to make money. Matt and Dom have both said, if you're eliminating your base audience and your donors because you are trying to change your mission, where does that money come from?
Something that's interesting to me is maybe like a compromise. If you can do that one social justice piece a season, but you have to fill out the rest of your season with shows that are going to bring money in the door and bring your audiences back. Say it is a musical, say it is a Disney, whatever, but can you add diversity to those shows? Just because you're doing Beauty and the Beast, or I don't even know if I can say that. Do we have the rights to that? But if you're gonna do your fluff musical or your fluff piece to bring in your base audience who likes those kind of things, fine, do those things. But I think you also then need to open up your door to the diversity aspect of theater now, right? So it's still a business. We still need people. We can't do hard-hitting social justice shows. So let's talk diversity, right? Like now this is that point where you can bring in actors, hopefully of a diverse cast, or can you bring in a designer or a director? Where can you start finding ways to open up this door for somebody else, even if you can't do the pieces that you want to do, especially right off the bat? Let's talk about steps in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you have to start in your own house, and, your rich old white audience and donors might not even notice at first that you just put a diverse cast in Beauty and the Beast or whatever. They are used to seeing the production value they love and the songs that they love. So, I think you can like slowly shift your culture. You're meeting your audience where they are, and then you're kind of guiding them to like the new way of doing things. So we've talked about how Peter Pan is super problematic. However, people are rewriting Peter Pan in less problematic ways. Maybe don't do classical Disney Peter Pan. Maybe not do Peter and the Starcatcher, because that's still really racist in the way it's written. But there are new versions of Peter Pan. There's Peter and Wendy, I think. Anyway, people are taking the stories you know and love and rewriting them better. And that, I think, is beautiful about theater, that we keep doing that and people are still interested. So that's how you shift the needle. If you're afraid of like alienating your audience and alienating your donors, you just do it in ways like that, in ways that they don't even notice. You just gotta like David Holcomb said, you just kind of like make them uncomfortable with your newness and kind of like shoulder them out, especially in ways like that. If you have a diverse cast, especially if you have donors that might have an issue with it, there's not really any way they can bring it up without really outing themselves for who they are. Like, you can say, like, oh, I don't want to do a social justice play because, it's going to alienate our families and blah, blah, blah. And we want to, like, keep the age range low so it's happy for everyone and we want people to be happy. Like, are you saying you can't be happy without a white cast? Like, it has to be a white cast for your audience to be happy? Like, there's not really a way to skirt around it without being very direct about, like, what they're trying to say. Yeah, that's a great way to do it. And one of the cool things about, like, this podcast is we have a space and channel to bring up these uncomfortable things and have the voices of staff and students and faculty heard in a way supported by the university, even though they might not share all of our views. You could do things that your donor and your boards might not agree with, but they understand why you're doing it.
And I hope that something that we're creating through this podcast is the idea of a brave space where we can hopefully have some uncomfortable conversations and know that, we don't reflect the ideals and values of everyone at the university, but we need to have these discussions regardless. So my hope is that this becomes a place where these uncomfortable conversations can happen, for better or worse. At least you're having them, and you don't have to worry about there's no backlash, right? This is a brave space where we can share and exchange ideas and hopefully grow. And like we always say at the beginning of this podcast, is that this isn't the final version of ourselves. And I hope that these spaces and these conversations help people to grow and to become a better version of themselves.
Yeah, I think also too, while we're talking about focusing on growth and sort of like the community there is in learning these things and implementing them in social justice work in general, I feel like there's this culture and desire to just point fingers when someone doesn't immediately understand. And something that I like that we brought up with like having a brave space is that we all start somewhere. And when it comes to this, I think it has to be like these spaces need to be founded on radical empathy. Like everybody starts learning about these issues somewhere. And it's important, albeit hard, especially if you're one of these marginalized people, to be patient when you can and focus your energy into educating and really believing the best of the people that you're trying to educate rather than just naming and blaming. With political education, especially, it always makes the journey so much easier for everyone involved. If you just assume the best of whoever you're talking to and assume that they do want what's best for the community and just haven't had the social group or support network or exposure to like get where they need to be, oftentimes people really do want to do the right thing. They just don't know what that right thing is. I think too there's this conversation happening about like how are we supposed to convince like the old white racist people that are in charge to like do these things. And maybe this is pessimistic of me, but like I don't really know how much faith I have in convincing those people. I think that the power lies in the community and in holding like the people on our own level accountable. To make a sort of analogy, I sort of learned and came up with like this belief of for myself through an organization in the Lehigh area I volunteer for. Lehigh Valley Stands Up does a lot of different efforts to defund the police, fight gentrification, support voting rights, all that kind of stuff. But they base all of the conversations and like trainings in like radical empathy and really connecting with people in a way that they can understand. So yes, like a lot of the work is sitting down with like the old white men and like getting them to do what they need to do, but like an even bigger chunk is like giving the people that we see every day like the resources to understand what the heck is going on in life. Because once enough people understand and are passionate about it and enough people are yelling, then like huge things can happen. So I think when it comes to social justice theater and like who do we want to reach, people who are really really stubborn and like adamant that like no, I do not want any part in whatever movement you're trying to uplift. If they're like that firm with their feet in the ground, like so be it. But like there are countless other people who are going to see these projects and be like, okay, like maybe I'll dip my foot in the water. I don't know if that's the phrase or if I just made that up. It's important to give everybody the opportunity because like if we can't convince one person, like we can convince another, and that can be enough.
And I think as a white person, learning to be anti-racist and learning to be more involved in social justice, it is hard and it is uncomfortable, but it's not as hard and uncomfortable as the lived experiences of people of color. Yeah, like no matter how hard we think it is to be like called out for being racist, facing racism is always much harder. I love the idea of radical empathy. I I think that's amazing, but it's important to know that no one owes you any emotional labor whatsoever. And if people do give that to you, like make sure you thank them because it's exhausting for them. You know, like I've seen it everywhere that like they've been fighting this forever. It's all new to a lot of white people, but like they've been waiting for us to like catch up for so long. It's important not to let that uncomfortability or even like anger you may either receive or give like get in the way of why you're trying to do this in the first place. And I think that if everyone who's involved in society, but specifically in theater, like you keep reminding yourself why you're doing it. Yes, it's hard to unlearn racism, and yes, it's hard for people to call you out on being racist because, of course, you don't want to be seen as racist. But if you keep like refocusing yourself of like, I am doing this because it's going to be better for my community, I am doing this because it's going to make people's lives easier, and you keep reaffirming that, then it makes the hard things easier. That's why it's so important for theaters to not just do shows about social justice, but like you have to lower ticket sales for people to get into your doors. Take the financial hit of giving away lots of free tickets if it means you're bettering your community, because that's better in the long run. You know, if you're only doing this because you're afraid of being canceled, like you're going to get canceled. That's just, people can see through like how disingenuous it is. It's important to continually try to reaffirm the why and think of the best reasons why. If it's best for your community to do this huge fundraiser instead of doing a show because someone in your community needs it, like that's what you do. And I get that it's a business, but like again, it's a better business model to do these things and to do what's right. But yeah, I think that's hard on a personal level and on like a company level. It can be difficult to do what's right, but it's always worth it. But again, none of it is as hard as facing what homeless people face, about what's facing our planet. There's so many things. We keep coming back to race because that's the big one right now, but like there's so many social justice issues and they are all harder than the backlash of you addressing them. So how do you address social, like just to recap, we're going to do a little recap because we talk a lot. So like, okay, so how do we address social justice issues from most direct to least direct? So obviously, if you are a theater of the oppressed, if you are a branch of theater of the oppressed, if you are a Latin or Hispanic theater, your whole company is devoted to addressing social justice issues for that community. It's probably the most direct way.
Casting and hiring. So as we talked about earlier, your plays don't have to be about any social justice issue. With casting and hiring, you can have a diverse and inclusive cast, inclusive designers, technicians, all that, and be diverse not in tokenism in that way. Reaching BIPOC, queer, disabled, trans, unhoused, or previously incarcerated people, and having them work in your company, whether it be by acting or by offering other creative expertise, that can be super huge. So one example that we talked about earlier was with Beauty and the Beast being like a fluff show that's meant to entertain, make money, more than send like a direct social justice message. But if you have an all-deaf cast, is that addressing social justice? And what if you have a cast of all non-binary actors? You can really make a difference in including those people in the projects that you do and offering them a platform, even if it's not specifically, like the plot isn't specifically targeted toward a specific issue. And it's also, we want to bring up, equally important to remove certain works from your options. So as we're having this conversation about like, oh, your play doesn't have to be about any specific issue, on the other hand, your plays shouldn't work against any of these social justice issues. So, for example, we're talking about the original script of Peter Pan with the racist Native American stereotypes. Works like that should be removed from your season selection because it's hurtful to people, and it does the opposite of what you're trying to do.
Another step in helping to address these issues is to make sure that your ticket prices are fair and that you're reaching the people who you want to reach. If you're typically selling tickets for hundreds of dollars or $50 or whatever it is, and you're not, and your audience isn't inclusive or reflects the demographic of your surrounding community, how do you address that? And one of those could be ticket prices. Can you do a pay what you will night? Can you donate tickets to different organizations and make sure that people who you want to be included in your theater are going to be included and feel welcome and feel like they have a place in your theater? So you can do that by addressing ticket prices and making sure that people who want or need the tickets are able to get them.
the big one that's been coming up a lot, season selection. Making sure that the shows you pick directly have a message in your season, whether, it's addressing racism, addressing climate issues. There's a theater company called the Contemporary American Theater Festival in West Virginia, and all of their shows are supposed to have like an impact of some kind, and it kind of varies on what they do, but that's like their whole thing. But you don't have to. You could just pick one show in your season. That's actually a really great way to start and see how the audience feels about it. Just make sure that the shows, one option is to pick a show that has a very direct, this is what we're talking about message.
Another one would be show interpretation. So, for example, you're doing Shakespeare, but you redirect or reinterpret the message so it addresses social justice issues directly. One example I have is a theater company called Shakespeare Behind Bars. So they take previously incarcerated folks and cast them in Shakespeare plays, and then they reinterpret the script or reorganize it so that it talks more to the experiences of incarcerated people. So that's one awesome way that you can do it if you just want to take like a play that already exists, but emphasize different parts of it to give it a completely different message.
Another way to do that would season selection behind the scenes, which is while you're picking your season, think about the playwrights who are writing the shows. Are they from a marginalized group, or do they have a lived experience that you want to relate? If you can't, I mean, you should all be able to find a playwright out there. But also, what about the design team, the director? So there are a lot of ways, maybe not even overtly on stage, to get people of diversity involved in your theater and in your season. Remember, it's a team sport. It's not a sport at all, right? It's a team. It's a collaborative effort, and so there are so many people, and probably more than your general audience member even thinks about, that are involved in shows. So another way to make sure that we're diversifying is behind the scenes, with playwrights, designers, run crew, whoever you can get in your doors. There's a lot going on for a show. So there's lots of ways to find diversity in a theater.
And then one thing I just want to tack onto that, in the We See You White American Theater document, they do mention how there's this really bad habit of theaters to make their social justice-y show or their show with a diverse cast their second stage as opposed to their main stage. And that's really harmful because you're essentially saying that this show is less than. So eliminating the idea of a second stage at all of your less than show is really important. Give all of your shows equal weight. Obviously, shows have different, for those who don't know about theater, there's usually like slots, of like show A and show C are like really big budget. Show B is a musical. This is a smaller show. That's totally fine. Not saying every show has to have the same budget and the same whatever, but as long as they're given equal promotion and they aren't billed as the less than show, that's really important as well. And that, don't stack your diverse people. If you're like, yeah, this one has a black director and a black playwright, but that's your second stage show and the rest of your show is all white, not cool. So we're getting ready to kind of wrap this up soon. We're just going to have some final thoughts and things. I want to bring up this quote from the Center for Artistic Activism, which is a group dedicated to documenting acts of artistic activism. You can like submit your own shows, and they're also working on a program to find out the tangible effects of artistic activism. This show was a forum theater, and it actually changed legislation, changed the laws for a community, so they're trying to like really work, and they have a lot of great resources. But one of their mission statements is, about artistic activism. Why? Because this stuff matters. Our modern political terrain is a highly meditated landscape of signs and symbols, stories and spectacles. To operate successfully on this cultural topography, we need to respond creatively. We believe culture and creativity are critical to the future of social and environmental justice. Creativity is also more accessible. Unlike the law, technology, and political access, cultural creativity and artistic expression is already in the possession of those who are most marginalized from formal spheres of power. It is critical for marginalized people and groups to effectively and collaboratively use their powerful creative skills for lasting social change. Which just sums up all of my feelings, honestly. Art is something everyone can access. Not everyone can get involved in politics, but most people can spend one night and go see a show at the theater. And they also have some great resources. And there's a few handouts, particularly one called Let's Step It Up that I'm drawn to. That's a worksheet for artists to like ensure effective activism based on like all of the research they had. It's really cool. It's so important that we see social justice in art because art is all around us all of the time, and it is a tool that everyone can access.
And to kind of build off of that, we have another quote that talks about how all of these different social justice issues are connected, even in no matter what industry you're in, they all relate. In a HowlRound article by Matthew Sekelic, he details how he feels obligated. So he says, how does this translate into specific demands? The movement for Black Lives platform is robust and thorough. Medicare for all, free education and abolition of student debt, workplace protections enshrined in the law, a shorter work week. Such policies work and other nations have them. We've had some of them in the past. Robust state funding helped build public colleges and the regional repertory system. And who hasn't benefited from the safety net of programs like unemployment insurance at some point? If we only work for justice within our field, we will never have it. We must work in coalition with those who share our plights.
Oh, that's so powerful. I mean, it's true. It's not just theater. Theater's a reflection of society, and we live in an unjust society. So it makes sense that for all this time, theater has been unjust, but that doesn't mean we can't do anything about it. What do you think, Matt? What are your thoughts on this
Thoughts?
episode?
I don't have thoughts. No. This has been a great episode from top to bottom, and I think we preached it the whole episode. Do your research, do your homework, and we did. Coming up to this podcast, we
How
spent
long have we been working on this?
at least a month, if not two, right? But it was important to us because the message is to be informed, and if you're not informed, get informed. So we spent the time to get informed and to be informed as best we can, and to relay the messages as true as we can to those listening, that there are problems and we hope to address them in any number of ways. The start is to get engaged, get involved, and get educated, and start making a difference just locally. And hopefully, we'll make the world a better place.
Any final thoughts, Dom?
It can be really daunting for folks who haven't had this conversation before to start talking about it, which I completely understand. Like, there's so much to learn out there. And it can be hard to know where to start. And also just the fear of having the wrong footing or doing the wrong thing. I think I would much rather be the person who makes a mistake and learns from it than does nothing at all. It's especially awesome that we have this space to talk about it and amplify these issues and these solutions. But like having conversations with people who are struggling in the same way as you, and or maybe have struggles that you don't particularly understand, it's important to look at activism not from an individual perspective, but understand that like this is a community effort, and like the more that you learn, the more that you're going to be able to help other people. So being patient with yourself and also just like empathetic and open to new ideas is so important. This stuff is complicated and like it's hard. It's really hard to navigate, as we've talked about. So just giving yourself the space to not know, but not like beating yourself up or giving up entirely when you don't have the answer.
I think that's perfect.
Something that I can add, or Bailey, are you going to give a final thought? I don't want to.
Go ahead.
Dom made me think of something that we've kind of said before in the past, and I want to reiterate, is just that we don't have all the answers. Not everything you research or look up is going to be true across the board. If you look up something and it says this is the right way to do it, not everyone of that group or of those people are going to agree with that statement. So the best you can do is try to be informed and do your homework. And if someone corrects you, take the correction and make sure that you note that there's no blanket answer or term or word that people want to hear or are okay with. The best you can do is again, educate yourself.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time working on this podcast, and we could have gone in so many different directions. But ultimately, what we decided was, it's important to continue the conversation outside of this, and hope at least this is like a jumping off point to get different conversations started. We could have talked about cultural appropriation and design and so many other aspects, but it's always going to be an ongoing journey as more education comes out, as we return back to a normal season, keeping in mind all of the things we learned about like accessibility from doing a virtual season and taking all of these lessons and continually improving. Theaters are a business, it's true, but like the heart of theater is artistic expression and storytelling. And it's just really important to be careful of what stories you're trying to tell, who you're trying to tell them to, and being a pillar of your community, I think is really important. Theater's been a safe haven for so many people. We need to make sure it stays that way, becomes a more inclusive safe haven.
Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you to Dom for being our special guest today. And thank you to Lehigh University Department of Theater for sponsoring this podcast.
Our podcast season is going to look a little different this season, so make sure you're following us on social media to be alerted when new episodes are coming out.
You can follow us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Facebook, and Instagram. Just search LU Theater, that's theater ending with an R-E, LU Theater Podcast Series, and on YouTube. All of our past episodes are available on the Lehigh University Department of Theater channel. Catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye. Really heats up towards the end here, right. You know?
Yeah.
Thank you to Phil Engel for writing this podcast music right now.